Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another weekly wrap up across the Scoop News Group universe. I am Greg Otto, the editor in chief of CyberScoop, and I'm joined by Billy Mitchell, editor in chief of FedScoop, and Jake Williams, director of strategy and a lot of other things for the State Scoop and EdScoop universe. Gentlemen, good to talk to you again. It's been another crazy week in the IT world and the world in general, of course, as we know. Billy, what was popping off for you this week on FedScoop?
Yeah, so we've had a couple really big takes and big stories on things that have been going on with coronavirus response. Two big ones that came out for us. Reporter Dave Nazepper had a pretty early look. We haven't heard about this program before that HHS is launched called HHS Protect. It's a kind of coordination or a coordinated look at 187 different databases that HHS is using to track the spread and whatnot of coronavirus, the PPE stuff, and they're using that to inform a lot of the decisions of the White House response task force. So it's a very big look into a program and a platform that we've been curious about for a while. We hadn't heard about it for the early days of the coronavirus. So it's kind of exciting to see that HHS is doing something there. On the other side, I came out with a pretty large look. I spoke to several CIOs, including federal CIO Suzette Kent, on how federal CIOs are responding to the coronavirus and using IT to make sure that agencies can continue their missions in this really trying time. And the big story there, I'll let you read, it's a long story, but the big story there is that IT modernization over the past several years, one of the main priorities of the administration has really come in clutch because things like cloud, move to digital signatures and forms and computerized digital forms have really made it easier to transition to telework and do business remotely during these really trying times.
Yeah, I would imagine also that this has also pushed agencies to realize that, oh, wait a minute, this is why we modernize. So we can deal with things like this. And in a crisis, we want to make it as easy as possible on our systems.
Absolutely. And I think the big thing is that in addition to that, a lot of this stuff that they've done has been kind of accelerated modernization stuff they already had planned in the past, and it'll be stuff that sticks around. And I wouldn't be very surprised if this changes things for a lot of agencies who weren't incredibly keen on telework in the past. I think they're going to probably say, hey, this is probably a new way for us to do business. So I know you guys have been covering COVID a lot as well. Greg, tell us about some of your stories.
Yeah, it's been another busy week on the COVID front, especially with cybersecurity involved. There has been reports. Google had a big report this week where their threat analysis group has found that there are over a dozen government-backed hackers that have been using the coronavirus to push phishing messages. And those phishing messages are being targeted at US government employees and officials and higher ups. And it's really interesting to see when this first started 3 or 4 weeks ago, the crux of worrying about phishing messages was tied to cyber criminals, small groups around the world, lone wolves. But now it looks like that this has become part of the strategy of nation state hacking groups, which is it's surprising. It's not surprising that there's another tool in the arsenal. It's surprising how quick this happened, that it's just a part of the espionage that is coming from all of the different world powers that like to use cybersecurity in their intelligence gathering arsenal. And it's really interesting to see how they are doing it. Google found that the phishing lures look like delivery emails, like if you're getting a special offer from Grubhub or DoorDash or Uber Eats or whatever. Google doesn't name any companies outright, but I would guess that that's what those messages are looking like, that it looks like, oh, 20% off DoorDash, and it's actually not. It's a phishing lure to get into your systems. So it's really ramped up. I think the real takeaway there is the number of countries that are using this as part of their cyber espionage. And Also, the DoD wasn't caught flat-footed in this. There was also an article, I guess you could say, was a blog post from the Department of Defense Cybercrime Center, where they were warning everybody that, hey, these were coming. They are coronavirus themed phishing lures, and you need to be watchful on this, because the way that it looks like they are working is they are targeting companies in the defense industrial base, hoping that they can get into those systems with the hopes that they can then move into DoD owned and operated networks. Obviously, I would imagine that these attackers are trying to get into these DIB companies to try to gather up what they want, but the real crown jewels is trying to get into the DoD networks. So not surprising, our adversaries have been trying to get into DoD networks since we've been connected to the internet, but interesting that there is so much effort being put into these phishing lures, and it's all being used under the guise of the coronavirus. So really interesting stuff. I'm sure we're going to be writing about this for weeks to come, but I know, Jake, you branched off into the non-COVID side of things. Tell us about the big package that was on State Scoop and Ed Scoop this week.
Yeah. So this week we released our special report on digital transformation. Obviously, a part of that was coronavirus related. So we do continue to follow those developments as it pertains to state and local governments, and of course, higher education. Kind of on that digital transformation / coronavirus front. We had a really interesting story this week from Colin Wood about how government CIOs have certainly gained some prominence in their states because of this pandemic and because of the technology that was needed to support systems during it. But when that return to normalcy comes, or whatever that looks like as we talk about it, they're going to have some pretty big challenges heading their way. One of the biggest ones is going to be budgetary. There's a pretty widespread consensus that there will be some economic impacts as we emerge from these lockdown, shelter-in-place conditions. So state CIOs kind of expect that those budget restrictions mean for them a little bit less funding and maybe a little bit less leeway to work on some of the more extraneous projects beyond just modernization, beyond just keeping the lights on. So on the higher education front, CIOs are talking a little bit about how this disruption caused by the pandemic is maybe the disruption that higher ed needed, right? I mean, we're all not too far removed from college. I think that when we were in college, all of us probably had the opportunity to maybe take an online class. Now, most universities are delivering their instruction fully online. And so for the most part, because they've done this, the learning and teaching experience is different. But if you notice from the national news, there haven't been any major technology disruptions. From a structure perspective, teaching and learning is different, obviously, but the technology itself seems to be working for the most part. Obviously, there are probably issues that we don't know about yet, but the technology seems to have held up. So we created a new podcast a couple weeks ago called Ed Scoop Edition, and I host that podcast. And on the most recent episode, the CIO of the University of Tulsa and a K through 12 IT director from Texas said that moving on from this, maybe education shouldn't go back to normal. Maybe education should embrace the things that we've now learned and chart a new course forward for education that's focused on equity and focused on access and really using the power of the internet to deliver education in a new way. And all of these, obviously culminate in this digital transformation package. So a lot of those pieces were included in that, but we also looked at other things. We looked at what Ben Freed, one of our reporters, looked at what coronavirus will do to states' digital transformation efforts, and meaning, will it give them more power to do more or take away resources for them to do less? And then even going one step further, Ryan Johnston looked at why is it so difficult for DMVs. We're all familiar with the experience of going to the DMV. There is a very structured issue that prohibits DMVs from being successful in modernizing their systems, which causes those wait times and those difficulties that we all have going to DMVs. So Ryan Johnson looked at that. And then Colin Wood looked at a related issue, which is states are struggling to move some of these systems, DMV included, and we talked about it last week on employment systems, struggling to move these systems from the mainframe. And we looked at in this package why that is and what states can do about it. So yeah, lots of stuff COVID and non-COVID related. But what's interesting is I think that common thread which is modernization and digital transformation and how it ties it all together, where some of the challenges that we faced with COVID have been the cause or have been the result of a lack of modernization.
Jake, do you get the sense that there are any CIOs out there sort of looking around the corner to say, okay, I'm probably not going to have my budgetary, means or what I thought I was going to get from a funding standpoint, and finding ways to do what they want to do, but are plugging it into the budget, like basically moving on the fly and going, oh, okay, I thought I was going to have $50,000 to do this project. Now I'm going to have 15. Can I still pull it off?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a little preliminary to have specific budgetary numbers and specific ideas of what the budgetary impacts are going to be for state CIOs. But I can tell you, I had a conversation yesterday with James Collins, the CIO of Delaware, and we'll be releasing that conversation in a video interview here on State Scoop in the next couple of days. And one of the interesting things that I heard from him is that now you've moved so much of the state workforce to telework in response to the COVID pandemic. Is there a way that we can cut some of those costs on either real estate or the cost of business and the cost of operating all of these systems if we can send more people remote? So the very response to the pandemic may be one of the solutions to dealing with the budgetary fallout afterward. Billy, what happened this week for you guys when we're not talking about COVID? I mean, I talked a little bit about some of our digital transformation coverage, but Billy, what happened on FedScoop when we talk about non-COVID news?
There's a lot still going on in the non-COVID world, even though COVID gets most of our attention. A lot on the DoD side that we've been following, a couple big stories there. Everybody's heard of JEDI, this massive $10 billion DoD cloud contract. It's absolutely a mess for a number of reasons. Protests abound since day one. And the latest is that this Inspector General report that has been in the works for about a year finally dropped late last week. And that showed that a lot of different things. It showed that there was some ethical violations by a couple of former and current DoD officials, but it also showed that the White House was not willing to take interviews for that. And it kind of really delves into that political problem that's been showing up in the greater broadcast news world, where Trump has kind of been not willing to participate in oversight and things like that. He obviously fired a bunch of inspector generals recently. One of those was the DoD IG. A couple Democratic lawmakers went as far as to say maybe this was part of the reason why he fired him, because he was not happy with that DoD IG prying into things like JEDI and the White House's potential involvement. But the long story short, the report came back and said that there wasn't enough evidence that the White House had a strong hand in any of that resulting contract to Microsoft, but it also said, hey, we really couldn't ask enough questions of White House officials to really tell either way. So this thing's a mess. As long as the White House is resisting to kind of sit down and talk, we're probably not going to know. As we know, Amazon is protesting it. As we know, President Trump is not a big fan of Amazon's. So this thing is full of controversy. And the latest piece is that the judge in the Court of Federal Claims that is overseeing the case has allowed the DoD to take back part of the contract evaluation and do corrective action on it. So we'll see where that goes, if anything changes there, but I don't think this thing's going to be over for a really long time. We're already 3 years into it, and I can see several, at least another year, maybe longer. Maybe this thing never gets awarded and they have to go back to the drawing board. But
I was going to say, are we ever actually going to see technology inside the DoD related to this contract?
In its current form, I don't know. I don't know. It's really hard to see anybody being happy with any outcome. But I think there is a chance that they do go back to the drawing board at some point if this corrective action doesn't work, or if Amazon were to win its protest, then Microsoft would obviously take some measure. This thing isn't going to happen within the next year, so it's going to be a long ride. Luckily, DoD does have a bunch of different cloud contracts and cloud services already, but this is supposed to be the big one that's supposed to, tie it all together and really give them end-to-end cloud capability. Maybe they should have done a multi-cloud contract from the start, but that's not for me to decide.
Hey, Billy, what do you think this means for large-scale cloud procurements in government down the road, or is it too early to tell?
I mean, I think it's going to be one of those use cases where people are probably hesitant to go down this path just because they've seen how just big of a struggle it's been for DoD. We've already seen the intelligence community. The intelligence community came out with a similar single award contract several years ago that they awarded to Amazon, which made everyone feel like probably Amazon was the front runner for this, but the intelligence community is coming out with another major cloud contract, and they've already decided that that's going to be multi-cloud. And the consensus is, if you talk to any cloud expert, you really do want to have a multi-cloud kind of hybrid cloud environment just so you have options. But for the DoD's sake, they decided that for security purposes and ease of use, single cloud was the way to go. So I think it is going to change things. It's going to be, make people hesitant moving in the single cloud direction in the future.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, we had a couple of years ago, the state of California tried to do a similar thing and create what was called Cal Cloud at the time. And that was to kind of have the State Department of Technology be the statewide broker of cloud services. And although they theoretically had pipelines to multiple clouds, it was an attempt to create a one-size-fits-all solution for an organization, the sixth largest economy in the world, maybe now the fifth largest economy in the world. A situation where they didn't have that many fittings. So yeah, it's interesting to see the DoD kind of struggling with the same thing, and be interesting to see how it continues to develop.
Absolutely. Well, I know we're running close on time, Greg. Why don't you bring it home with any final thoughts and then final
look, not every hack that we've been writing about on Cyberscoop has been COVID related. Earlier this week, even last weekend, we broke news that a big IT services provider, Cognizant, was hit by Maze ransomware over the weekend. And this has been a really, really big story for us because a lot of these third-party IT service providers are based in India and do a lot of outsourcing of their work. And when something gets hit by ransomware, the effects are just almost 10x, I feel like, because only Cognizant really knows who their company services, and you have no idea how many services are offline, what companies got hit by this. It's really a mishmash of figuring out what happened there. And, it's really interesting from the standpoint of ransomware groups. About a month ago, there were reports that the ransomware groups were going to stop everything due to the pandemic and kind of slow down, and especially not go after hospitals or any healthcare sector things, or just kind of slow it down overall, because who needs this crisis in the middle of a pandemic? And shocking that the criminals were not up to their word. It seems like things have just escalated across the board. Hospitals have been hit across the world. And even just beyond the healthcare sector, we're seeing a lot of ransomware attacks because people are just taking control of the pandemic. So I shouldn't say control, taking advantage. I think we would all like to see a little bit more control being taken on this pandemic. But it just goes to show that, even though I said that this is not really COVID related, it kind of is, in that people are taking advantage of the fact that we have nothing but time on our hands. And if you don't have your security up to snuff, you're going to be a target more than ever, because, hey, people need money. People are out of work across the world. And if your security isn't up to snuff, you're going to be a target. So I would not be surprised if we see some bigger targets in the weeks to come. But the Cognizant thing was huge because, hey, it's a supply chain story. It's a ransomware story. It's everything we write about on Cyberscoop wrapped into one. So we'll be following up on it. But it was a really, really big deal for us in the beginning of the week.
Great.
So, I wonder what's going to happen over this next weekend. Wonder who's going to be hit. Let's hope it's nobody and we have a quiet weekend. And we will talk again next week. Pleasure as always, gentlemen.
Great. Thanks, guys.